Hello everybody, this is Beth from Headspace Connections. We just wanted to say that we were so excited about being able to be presenters for this year's 2023 Plural Positivity Conference. We do apologize. We are at our parents' house, so if you hear any background noises, I apologize for that ahead of time. Now, for trigger warnings for our presentation, we're going to have talks of various types and severity of abuses and symptoms. If there's anything else that's triggering for anybody, we do apologize. Those were just the biggest things that we figured would possibly be triggering for most people. But without further ado, we will go into our presentation. Now, most are familiar with trauma disorders such as PTSD. However, what many don't realize is that the list of trauma-based disorders is quite a bit more extensive and more common than people realize. As of today, there are a few disorders classified as trauma-based, and PTSD is just the start of them, with the rest of them increasing in severity and complexity. The list of known disorders is this, but not limited to PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder, BPD, borderline personality disorder, derealization and depersonalization, sometimes known as DRDP, OSDD, which is an otherwise specified dissociative disorder, previously known as DDNOS, or dissociative disorder not otherwise specified. Partial DID, which is a little bit newer of a diagnosis that has been researched lately, or partial dissociative identity disorder as its full name. DID, or dissociative identity disorder, previously known as MPD or multiple personality disorder, and then polyfragmented DID, previously known as complex MPD, but is sometimes still referred to as complex DID. However, we are going to discuss the most complex of them all, and that is polyfragmented DID. Being that we are a polyfragmented system ourselves, some of the main questions that we are usually asked by others in the plural community is, how do you know that you're a polyfragmented system? What are your symptoms? What is the difference between DID and polyfragmented DID? Among many others, but these are the most common. So today, that is what we are going to discuss, is the similarities and the differences between the two. Keep in mind, however, that the research we are presenting is a mix of articles we managed to find and through our own personal experiences, since research of this disorder is still very minimal at best. Now, most in attendance at this conference are already familiar with what DID is and what it entails. But for those that are just discovering and or wanting to learn more, in the DSM-5, DID is known as a trauma-based dissociative disorder that has these 5 main characteristics associated with it. 1 is the presence of at least 2 or more distinct personality states. 2 is reoccurring periods of amnesia that go beyond just normal forgetfulness. 3, symptoms tend to cause significant distress and or impaired functioning in daily life. 4, symptoms can't be caused by substance abuse or caused by another medical condition. 5, symptoms aren't associated with accepted cultural or religious practices. Now, to clarify this, as we mentioned before, DID previously used to be known as MPD. However, that name was changed in 1994 to DID, when, with extensive research, it was realized that the alternate personalities were a symptom of a trauma disorder and not the defining factor for the disorder itself. And also, despite popular belief that DID is a rare condition, which some believe even today, Richard Kluft published a research paper in 1983 stating that DID was no longer considered rare due to the increasing number of patients he was treating at the time. Now, dissociative disorders are as complex as they sound and can vary from person to person based on their set experiences. However, one thing that people with these disorders all share is early childhood trauma that ranges in severity and duration. Now, some may argue that everyone dissociates, and while it is true everyone dissociates to some degree, like daydreaming or driving and not realizing they made it home already, but when someone suffers severe trauma in early childhood, the dissociation that was once used as a means of entertainment now becomes a defense mechanism that is turned into a tool for survival. And as the trauma progresses in severity or increases in duration, the dissociation can become so severe that these experiences can become compartmentalized and split off, hidden in the back, so to speak, waiting until a time it can be opened up later in hopes of closure or processing. This is where CPTSD, BPD, DRDP are on the scale. OSDD, partial DID, DID, and polyfragmented DID are when these compartments or boxes can be split off so much that they build their own identity based around the set information that they carry, and that's when you will start getting the alternate personality formations, or alters as we will call them here. Now we know the basics about DIDs, so what about polyfragmented DID? How did it come about, and what is the difference between DID and polyfragmented DID? The term polyfragmentation and polyfragmented were terms coined by Bennett G. Braun in 1986 as a term to describe people with DID or OSDD with over 100 alters and possibly many fragments. Richard Clough used complex multiplicity and complex MPD in 1979 to describe MPD patients with 26 or more alters. Supermultiple has always been used to describe someone with 100 or more, but nobody really knows where the term came from. Now, over the years, though, polyfragmented would be more popular in medical literature. However, the meaning or parameters for the term can change from professional to professional. Complex and polyfragmented were separate terms by separate researchers in the beginning. However, these terms have now been merged to mean the same thing with a lesser focus to alter count, similar to Clough's original definition. And because multiple numbers are given for their criteria, this makes it less relevant. Polyfractal is a term for systems that have larger numbers than most, but it's not commonly used. Other terms include polymultiple, polyfaceted, and polyplural. For us personally, because of our system size, we have roughly 60 to 100,000. So for us, we prefer the term hyper-polyfragmented. Another term that is used is super-polyfragmented. And then polyfragmented DID, despite there being so little information available about it, is one of the most studied dissociative disorders, with OSDD being a close second. But polyfragmented OSDD is not currently recognized. However, it can exist and is just as difficult to diagnose, along with partial DID. Similar to polyfragmented DID, the symptoms are very similar to each other, including the amnesia, derealization, depersonalization, identity confusion, and identity alteration. However, the most notable difference between the two is the complexity of the system itself, with the average range to be considered polyfragmented is an alter count of 100 plus. Now, as mentioned before, the numbers vary from professional to professional, but this seems to have become the standard in recent years. It is typically caused by prolonged sadistic abuse that extends over long periods of time and often involves many abusers, such as cult abuse, ritual abuse, long-term abuse that was integrated into day-to-day life. Most diagnosed as polyfragmented have histories of ritualistic, organized, creative, purposeful exploitation of dissociative responses by abusers, or notably vicious abuse. It is also interesting to note that previous researchers concluded that the more alters a system has, the more noticeable a switch would be. However, they quickly realized that this was not always the case, and quite contrary to popular belief even today, for polyfragmented systems, switching normally has less obvious signs than those with less complex systems. Switches can be very subtle and covert, and very rarely will it ever be super noticeable or overt. But again, this can vary from system to system. For us personally, the switching can be so subtle that even we won't notice a switch has occurred until later. Another seemingly common characteristic for polyfragmented systems is a complex internal organization, such as a complex or vast inner world and structures like subsystems, side systems, which are similar to subsystems but has a little bit more of a broader term, and layers, an example of the layers being like levels in a video game. Sometimes, depending on the complexity, systems can even have a hierarchy in place to keep things more organized if larger numbers are presented. Currently, this is the type of organization we have personally because of our numbers. Epochs, which are divisions or groups based on a time period of splitting, can be common as well. Another characteristic is a complex splitting pattern. Those that are polyfragmented will split more often and will split multiple members at once. An example would be when someone that is DID will split maybe one or two or a handful of alters at once for a certain traumatic event. Someone who's polyfragmented will split hundreds or thousands of alters at a time. And because of this, many times polyfragmented systems will include numerous fragments, subsystems, and individual alters. For those that are here in learning, fragments are more one-dimensional and may be very similar to each other, and usually will have a very hyper-specific job or role, whereas alters are more three-dimensional and generally have more responsibilities. However, based on our findings, we have seen fragments with increased use and interactions can become more three-dimensional and be able to take on more responsibilities. Now, because of the amount possible and oftentimes due to the sheer size of polyfragmented systems, co-consciousness is also more frequent. This is where groups of alters will front at the same time as opposed to just one alter at a time, making switches that much harder to detect. However, that's not always the case. A number of well-defined alters that may appear similar to non-polyfragmented systems, including a relatively small fronting group, is possible as well. I know for us personally, we do have groups that will front at any given time as opposed to just one person at a time. So usually the minimum per group is about 6 to 8, but can be less or more depending on the groups that we have fronting at the time. Something that is also noted is mass introjection, or a large number of alters that are based on fictional characters or factual persons that are also known as fictives and factos can be common as well. You will usually hear these terms more commonly today. Now, polyfragmentation, although as intriguing as it may seem, however, is not always fun. Dr. Frank Putman reported that in his studies that he noted that the greater number of alters, the greater a multiple self-destructiveness and lack of non-dissociative coping skills or mechanisms. Amnesic barriers can also be very difficult to break because of the severe amount of splitting. Other issues are obsessive symptoms that appear like hyperfixations. These and other things have been just a few of the issues that we have as a system have had to personally deal with ourselves. Note this though, that if you are diagnosed as polyfragmented or are considering whether your system is or not, it does not make you any more broken, so to speak, or less lovable. And if you are not polyfragmented, it does not make your trauma any less severe. Trauma is trauma, and there is no such thing as too little, and whether others consider it less or severe or not is quite frankly irrelevant. We have had many in the Plural community questioning themselves after hearing our story or about our alter counts, but the truth of the matter is that not everyone will have the same windows of tolerance or the exact same circumstances and experiences. So whatever your experience has been personally, you are valid. That's the end of our presentation, and we hope that it was enlightening. We hope that it did help give you guys a little bit of information. We do apologize that there really wasn't a whole lot to go on As I said, we had a hard time looking for specific information about polyfragmentation, and a lot of the stuff we found was kind of all just said the same thing. But we do hope that this did help those of you that are looking, and we hope to talk to you guys after, and we hope to see you guys again next year.